So we're finally at the last chapter of your textbook, chapter 20, in which the authors go over some current and future directions in the field of personality. So what we're going to do today is just run through all of those different domains that we spent the entire semester going over. And we'll give just a quick summary of each one, and then talk about some current and future directions within each one of those. We'll begin with the dispositional domain. So, does anybody remember what this one was all about? Have you forgotten? It's been too long. So what are these folks most concerned about? What do they study? It's basically like traits. They're interested in traits like identifying and measuring basic traits. So this was the, let's see, we talked about all the different taxonomies and theoretical and measurement issues in trait psychology. So we went over the big five, the Wiggins circumflex and all that. All these people that just want to figure out what aspects of personality are actually stable and produce these individual differences that we see in behavior. So in the future, it's likely that they will continue to do what they have always done. So the trait perspective has been around for a long time. It's one of the oldest aspects of the field of personality. So they're most likely to continue to emphasize finding the best way to measure traits and trying to some extent, identify new traits. So we talked about different measurement strategies like implicit versus explicit measures. Does anybody remember what this distinction was all about? Explicit versus implicit? What is an explicit measure? No love from my class today, huh? So an explicit measure is when you directly ask someone how they feel about something or what they would do in a situation. So that is going to be like most questionnaires. You're explicitly telling them what you want to know. Whereas an implicit measure is one of those roundabout ways of getting at what you want to measure. I mentioned the implicit measures of self-esteem, those weird ones where you'll rate all the letters in the alphabet on how attractive they are, and then supposedly people with higher self-esteem will rate the letters in their own name more positively. Or you smell your own arm and rate how good you smell, and people with higher self-esteem will rate themselves more highly. Those are both implicit measures, because you're not asking them how they feel about themselves, you're just using these kind of abstract methods. And like I said, there's also this goal of trying to identify new traits that are not currently measured very frequently. So one good example of this would be the notion that we should perhaps add this dimension of honesty and humility to the big five. As a matter of fact, there are some researchers who are spearheading this, and they have this scale that they call the hexacode, which is like Texaco but with an H in the front. A lot of those letters are the same ones that we use for the big five, but then they've got the H on the front, which is emphasizing that honesty and humility is the new factor. They even have a website set up, hexaco.org, that I was looking at earlier, where they give their measure and articles and all that stuff. So we went over the dispositional domain first, and then we had the biological domain.
Could you go back a little, please?
Oh, yeah, go back for just a second, sure. So what did we talk about within that biological domain? What were some of the specific things we mentioned?
How our body influences our personality.
Yeah. So that would be more like the physiological approach. We had a whole chapter on physiological perspectives on personality, so things like heart rate and blood pressure, brain activity, and all that. Were y'all finished with that slide? Okay. Yeah. And of course, we also talked about genetics, right? The role of genes in personality development. And there's a lot of reason to think that new advances in technology are going to lead to an enhanced understanding of the role of genetics in personality. One specific recent advance that we mentioned in this class was the DRD4 gene. Does anybody remember what that one does?
Sensation seeking?
Yeah, it's related to sensation seeking, or I think the people who did this research call it novelty seeking, but it's pretty much the same basic concept. So people with a certain version of that gene seem to be more motivated to seek out new and exciting experiences. And so there are potentially a ton of different genes that we could discover like this one that are specific genes that are linked to different traits. And so we also know that fMRI technology is improving. It's been around for maybe a couple of decades, but it's still relatively new, relatively young technology. And they're still working on coming up with enhanced resolutions, so letting them see more detail about what's going on inside the brain. If you recall, the fMRI is used to see patterns of activity within the brain. And right now, we're still kind of limited in regard to the accuracy of these scanners. So I've had some friends who went to these fMRI training sessions where they actually got to take measurements, and they've come back and told me it's nowhere near as precise as you might think based on reading the research and the things that you hear in your classes. And essentially what you have is a window of time that you're measuring, and the researchers do their best to be precise, but it's not like we get a one-to-one look at the brain and we see exactly what's happening every second that someone looks at something. There's a little bit of guesswork and estimation that still goes on in this stuff, so they're still fine-tuning that. And then, what was the other big thing we talked about in the biological domain? Anybody remember? One of my favorites?
Evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, the evolutionary perspective. Yeah, so that perspective is being applied to a lot of new topics throughout psychology, including the field of personality. And of course, the big advantage of the evolutionary perspective compared to more traditional perspectives on psychological phenomena is that it incorporates both ultimate and proximate explanations for behavior. So do you all remember the distinction between ultimate and proximate explanations? What's an ultimate explanation? What does that tell you?
Universal.
In a sense, it tends to be broader in scope.
What happens over time?
What happens over time?
Or is it what's happening in the current situation?
Yeah, so it looks at essentially what has happened over the history of the human species. So an ultimate explanation tells us why a certain trait or behavioral pattern evolved in the first place, why it exists at all as part of the human behavioral repertoire. Whereas a proximate explanation is like you see in most areas of psychology, where you look at how things that are present right in the here and now impact our behavior. So like how you treat me based on my gender. Right? If I were a female professor, maybe you'd treat me slightly differently. So you can take both an ultimate and proximate explanation for those types of behaviors. And you really need both of them in order to get the most complete understanding of the subject matter. So one specific example of this evolutionary perspective being applied to new topics is some more recent research on the role of reproductive motives and things like hormones in sexual jealousy. So this is going to tie into some of those other aspects of the biological domain, like the physiological perspective was where we talked about the hormone research. So we know that testosterone specifically tends to increase a lot of different aggressive types of behaviors, but there are other hormones too that can impact both male and female behavior. And you see some really interesting patterns when people are in these mating types of situations, depending on the levels of hormones that they have in their system. So I have some friends who are doing this type of research, and it's really interesting work. All right, so any questions about this stuff? All right, so that was our first two domains, those dispositional and biological, and then we had the intrapsychic domain. So what did we talk about in this one? What's that?
Freud.
Yeah, Freud. This was our Freudian chapter, right? So the intrapsychic domain is all about these different things that are going on inside your head, these unconscious processes that might have some kind of an influence on your behavior and your conscious thoughts and feelings. Now, as I've mentioned time and time again, there aren't a lot of people who are strict Freudians that are still around in the field of psychology, but some of his theories regarding repression, for example, are still being examined. So there has been some recent research, and some that's still in the works, on whether people actually do repress memories and why we might push things out of our memory. So it certainly didn't happen at the level that Freud thought that it did, where people would have really traumatic experiences and then just push them all the way down into the unconscious. But you still do have people who forget pretty significant things from time to time, and then they'll remember them years later. So that's another interesting line of research that's ongoing.